Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind troubled with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems. The ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve while rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Let my voice wash over you at a comfortable volume and allow yourself to be distracted from the stresses and worries that play on your mind. Whether you need help falling asleep or going back to sleep in the middle of the night, you can trust me to keep you company and help you to wake up tomorrow in a rested state. You may need to try out Sleepy Time Tales for a few nights to get used to this slightly strange idea, but I believe it will be well worth your while. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So settle down, relax, and allow yourself to get lost in my telling of tonight's story. Before we get to tonight's reading, I'd like to ask for a few minutes of your time. Sleepy Time Tales is purely a listener-supported podcast. I can only keep it going, paying for the services and tools I use, and justify the time that I use on it, thanks to the generosity and support of listeners like you. So if you're finding Sleepy Time Tales useful, if it helps you to get a restful night, and you would like to keep it going out to thousands of your fellow insomniacs, please consider supporting on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is monthly support that not only helps me keep the lights on, but can also get you fun bonuses based on your contribution level. So go along there, take a look, and sign up if you're interested. And I would like to shout out a new patron, who is Gina, who signed up recently. Thank you very much to you for your support. I'm very grateful, and I hope you enjoy your bonuses. And of course, monthly can be a big ask, so you can also make once-off tips through the tip jar on the website. And if you'd like to help out the show without having to do so financially, because times are tough, you can just tell people about it. If you know someone who's struggling to sleep and you think that they will benefit from listening to Sleepy Time Tales, just tell them where to find it. And now we are going to pick back up in the middle of some warfare in the Dark Ages. We pick up this week with the Dark Ages, 476 to 918, by Charles Oman. Advancing from Paris, Clodovic crossed the Loire and met the Visigoths and their king on the Campus Vaucladensis, the plain of Vougelet near Poitiers. Whether from cowardice or from distrust of his own generalship, Alaric held back from fighting, but his army forced him to give battle. He attacked the Franks, was utterly defeated, and fell with the greater part of his men. So crushed were the Visigoths by the disaster that Clodovic was able to overrun all the provinces between the Loire and the Garonne without striking another blow. He entered Bordeaux in triumph and there spent the winter. Next spring he marched against Toulouse, the Gothic capital, and took it, and with it the great horde of the Visigothic kings, including many of the trophies that Alaric and Ataulf had carried off from Italy 100 years before. Meanwhile, Clodovic's Burgundian allies overran Provence and captured all its cities save Arles. To add to the troubles of the Visigoths, they were distracted by civil strife. One party recognized as King Amalric, the infant son of Alaric, a Theodoric's daughter, his lawful queen. The other elected Gesalic, a bastard son of Alaric who had fortified himself in Narbonne and Barcelona. But the Franks and Burgundians drove Gesalic over the Pyrenees, and it appeared as if there was about to be an end of all Visigothic power north of those mountains. Meanwhile, Clodovic returned from Toulouse to Tours, where he found awaiting him ambassadors from the Emperor Anastasius, who saluted him by their master's command with the titles of proconsul and patrician, and presented him with a diadem and purple robe. Anastasius sought by these honours to win an ally against Theodoric the Ostrogoth, with whom he had lately quarrelled. Clodovic accepted them with alacrity, because of the prestige they gave him in the eyes of his Roman subjects, who saw his power over them formally legalized by the grant of the emperor. This year was the culminating scene of Clodovic's life, for in the next year fortune turned somewhat against him. The great Theodoric interfered in the Gothic War as the guardian and protector of his grandson Amalric. His armies routed the united Franks and Burgundians near Arles, where they are said to have slain 30,000 men. They then reconquered Narbonne and all the Mediterranean coast as far as Spain. Clodovic's conquests were thus restricted to the land west of the Cevennes, but still comprised the greater bulk of Visigothic Gaul, with the three great cities of Poitiers, Bordeaux, and Toulouse. Only the Narbonensis in Provence was saved from him by Theodoric, who now chased away the usurper Gesalic, and ruled all Spain and South Gaul till his grandson Amalric came of age. Checked on the south by the great Ostrogoth, Clodovic turned north to round off his dominions by the acquisition of the last independent Frankish state. Sigbert of Coln was now very old, and his ambitious son Cloderic was persuaded by Clodovic not only to dethrone, but to slay his father. When he had seized the kingdom, Clodovic affected great wrath and indignation against him, procured his death at the hands of assassins, and then annexed his kingdom. All the Frankish states were now united under one hand, but Clodovic did not long survive his last success, though according to the strange words of his admirer, Bishop Gregory of Tours, the Lord cast his enemies under his power day after day, and increased his kingdom, because he walked with a right heart before him, and did what was pleasing in his sight. In 511, this sanguinary ruffian, murderer, and traitor died, just after he had presided at Orleans over a synod of 32 Gaulish bishops, who were anxious to repress Arianism, and gladly called in the secular arm of their orthodox lord to their aid. Clodovic was morally far the worst of all the Teutonic founders of the kingdoms. Even Gaiseric the Vandal compares favourably with him. Yet his work alone was destined to stand, not so much from his own abilities, though those were considerable enough, as from the happy chance which put his successors in religious sympathy with their subjects, and preserved the young kingdom, during the following generation, from any overthrow with such powerful foes as those who were destined to overthrow the monarchies of the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, and the Vandals. Chapter 5. Justinian and his Wars, AD 528 to 540. For 3/4 of a century during the reigns of the four cautious and elderly Caesars, whose annals fill the space between 457 and 527, the East Roman Empire had been recovering its strength and storing up new energy for a sudden outburst of vigor under the able, restless, and ambitious sovereign who followed the aged Justinian I. Justinian, the son of Sabatius, the brother of Justinus, was nearly 40 years old when he became, by his uncle's death, sole ruler of the empire. He was no mere uncultured soldier like his predecessor. When he obtained promotion in the army, Justinian sent for his nephew from the Dardanian village where his family dwelt, and had him reared in the capital in all accomplishments, which benefited the heir of a great fortune. By the acknowledgement of his bitterest enemies, Justinian had an extraordinary power of assimilating knowledge of all kinds. He took a keen interest alike in statecraft and architecture, in theology and law, in finance and music. When his uncle came to the throne, the student soon developed into the practical administrator, for Justinus trusted him with all those details of civil government, which he himself was unable to understand or manage. It soon became known that the heir of Justinus was a man of extraordinary ability and untiring thirst for work. In an age when most young men would have been tempted by the sudden elevation to plunge into the enjoyments that lay open to an imperial prince, Justinian applied himself to mastering all the tiresome details of the administration of the empire. Men noted with surprise that he never seemed happy, save when he was in his cabinet, surrounded by his secretaries, his registers, his files of reports and dispatches. He was like the Aristotelian character who was too indifferent to things pleasurable, for nothing save work appeared to have any attraction for him. He rose early, spending his day in administrative duties, and his night in reading and writing. As he grew older, he seemed to dispense with sleep altogether, as if he had become free from the common necessities of man's nature. There was something strange and horrible in his cold-blooded, untiring energy. Superstitious men whispered that he was inspired by a restless demon who gave him no peace, or that he was actually a demon himself. Had not a belated courier met him after midnight, pacing the dark corridors of the palace with a fearful and changed countenance that was no longer human, or even, as the story grew, with no face at all, a shapeless, monstrous shadow. But that Justinian was a man, with all a man's waywardness and recklessness, was proved ere long. To the surprise of the whole population of the empire, and the utter horror and confusion of all respectable persons, it was suddenly noised abroad that the heir of the empire had announced his intention of marrying Theodora, the dancer, the chief star of the Byzantine comic stage. The staid, passionless bureaucrat was contemplating a step from which Nero or Heliogabalus would have shrunk with dismay. We have elaborate but untrustworthy details of the scandalous early life of Theodora in a book, The Secret History, which bears the name of the historian Procopius, but was in all probability no work of his. She was the daughter of Acacius the Cypriot, an employee of the Green faction at the Hippodrome, and had for some years appeared on the stage as an actress and dancer. So much we may take for truth. Knowing the general character of Roman actresses, we may assume that there was some foundation for the stories over which the secret history gloats. As to the particular facts alleged, we may conclude that they are untrustworthy. Among those which the secret history gives us as most certain are the statements that she was a vampire and often held intercourse with evil spirits. The rest is written in the same spirit of silly and superstitious malignity. But we may fairly conclude that the marriage of Justinian was a scandal and a wonder. His mother and his aunt, the Empress Euphemia, as we know, set their faces against it. But he went on in his usual steady persistence, gradually wore down the wool of his old uncle Justinus, and formally took Theodora to wife. The emperor was even induced to bestow upon her the high title of patrician. In brains and power of will, Theodora was fit enough occupant for the imperial throne, whatever her past history may have been. She was ambitious, restless, and capable as a husband, and acted as much as his colleague as his consort. We shall see how on one occasion of crisis she stood boldly forward and interposed between him and destruction. Her worst enemies did not suggest she was an unfaithful or profitless spouse to him. The secret history itself calls her after her marriage luxurious, cruel, capricious, arrogant, but does not accuse her of evil living or folly. Against this we may set the well-ascertained facts that she was devoted to the exercises of religion, and founded many charitable institutions. Remembering the dangers of her own youth, she built a great institution for the reclaiming of fallen women, the first of the kind known in Christendom. She was zealous in buying and freeing slaves, and in caring for the bringing up of orphans and the marriage of dowerless girls. Theodora was by all accounts the most beautiful woman of her age. Even the secret history allows this, adding only that she was rather below the middle stature, that her complexion was somewhat pale, and that she devoted untold hours to the mysteries of the toilet. 2 portraits of her have survived, one at the monastery on Mount Sinai, the other in the church of San Vitale at Ravenna, 2 spots so far apart as to call up vividly to our memory the wide extent of her influence. Unfortunately, the hieratic style of art into which Roman portraiture had long sunk, and the intractable nature of mosaic as a material, do not allow us to judge from these representations what was her actual appearance. Justinian has left behind him an almost unparalleled reputation as a conqueror, a builder, and a lawgiver, besides a less happy record of theological activity. It is mainly, however, with his foreign policy that we shall have to concern ourselves. The other spheres of his labor are better fitted for another work. But his dealings with Africa, Italy, and Spain form a great landmark and turning point in the history of southern Europe, and the results were not entirely exhausted until the 11th century. His long struggles with Persia are less interesting and less important, but they filled a great space in the view of contemporary observers, and were not without their moment. Justinian's reign opened with a fierce war with the old Persian king Kobad. The struggle which this monarch had waged with Anastasius 25 years before had been so indecisive that the Sasanian longed for a new trial of arms. Almost immediately on Justinian's accession, he issued his declaration of war, using as a pretext the erection of some fortifications near Nisibis, which were being constructed by Belisarius, governor of Daris, a young officer whose name was destined to be intimately associated with the whole history of Justinian's reign. The war opened with a defeat in the open field, suffered by the Roman army of Mesopotamia. But when reinforcements came up, the Persians retreated beyond their frontier. After the winter of 528-529 was over, neither side advanced in force, and all that occurred was a flying Roman raid into Assyria, and an equally hasty Persian incursion into Syria, both of which did some harm, but had no practical result on the fate of the war. Things went far otherwise in the next year, 530. The Persians crossed the frontier in full force and marched on Daris, where they were met by Belisarius, who had lately been appointed commander-in-chief in the east. Under the walls of Daris, the decisive battle of the war was fought, in which Belisarius, with 25,000 men, defeated 40,000 Persians by means of his tactical skill. The plan which he worked was to draw back his center, containing all the Roman infantry, and, when the Persians followed it, to launch against their exposed flanks all his cavalry, a miscellaneous gathering of Hunnish light horse, Teutonic Huruli from the Danube, and Roman cataphracti or cuirasses. This plan, much resembling Hannibal's maneuver at Cannae, and perhaps consciously copied from it, resulted in the complete rout of the Sasanian host. After this defeat, Kobad commenced abortive negotiations for peace. But the war was protracted into the next year, and Belisarius did not fare so well in 531. In stopping a Persian raiding force on the middle Euphrates, which aimed at Syria, and had turned the southern flank of the Mesopotamian fortresses, he suffered serious loss at the affair of Callinicum. Though he was defeated, his resistance had yet turned and frustrated the Persian expedition. 4 months later, King Kobad died, and his successor, Khosroes I, made peace on the basis of the status quo ante, fearing to continue the Roman war while his throne was insecure. The end of the Persian War left Justinian free to cast his eyes on the affair of his neighbours to the west. Though so indecisive, it had not been without its uses, for it had permitted him to test the solidity of his army and to discover several officers of merit and one general of commanding ability, the young Victor of Darus. Belisarius was now 26 years of age. He was, like his master, a native of the borderland between Thrace and Illyricum, bred at an unknown village named Germania, but not, as the name of his birthplace might seem to suggest, of Teutonic, but of Thracian blood. He had entered the army at a very early age and had fought his way up to the post of governor of the great fortress of Darus before he was 24. His favor with Justinian had been confirmed by his marriage with Antonia, the friend and confidant of the Empress Theodora. She was a clever, unscrupulous, domineering woman, several years older than her husband, and exercised over him a domestic tyranny which any man less easy-tempered than the young general would have found unbearable. The position of Belisarius and Antonia at the court of Justinian has not been unaptly compared to that of Marlborough and his imperious wife at the court of Queen Anne. But it is only fair to the East Roman to say that he was in every way a better man than the Englishman, while his wife had all the faults of Duchess Sarah, without her one redeeming virtue of fidelity to her spouse. Before he was able to turn his attention to the West, and just after the crisis of the Persian War had passed, Justinian was exposed to a sharp and sudden danger, the most perilous experience of his whole career. We have already spoken at some length of the rivalries of the blue and green factions, and explained how, in the early 6th century, the Greens were reckoned heterodox and supporters of the house of Anastasius, while the Blues were orthodox and favored Justinius and his nephew. Accident conspired with the innate turbulence of the factions to stir them up into fierce disorder in the year 532, and brought about the celebrated Nika sedition. To provide for the expenses of the Persian War, Justinian had not only drawn upon the hoarded wealth of Anastasius, but had imposed heavy additional taxation. This act made his instruments, the Quator Tribonian and the Praetorian prefect John of Cappadocia, very unpopular. Both of them were suspected, and not incorrectly, of having used the opportunity to fill their pockets at the expense of the public. And John the Cappadocian had made himself particularly odious by his cruel treatment of defaulting debtors. In January 532, there were riotous scenes in the circus, caused by the protests of the Greens against the oppression they were suffering. There soon followed tumults in the streets, and the factions settled their grievances with blood and knife. Justinian often allowed the Blues a free hand in dealing with their adversaries, but on this occasion his supporters had gone too far. The police seized many ringleaders of both factions, and 7 of the chiefs were condemned to the axe or cord. While an angry crowd stood round, 5 of the rioters were put to death, but when the last 2, a blue and a green, were being hung, the cord slipped twice, owing to the nervousness of the executioner, and the criminals fell to the ground. The populace then burst through the police and hurried off the men to sanctuary in a neighboring monastery. This incident proved the beginning of a fearful uproar. Instead of dispersing, the mobs paraded the place, shouting for the dismissal of the unpopular ministers John and Tribonian. Blues and Greens united in the cry. The whole city poured out into the streets, and the police were trampled down and driven away. Frightened by the storm, Justinian had the weakness to yield. Instead of sending out the imperial guard to clear the streets, he announced that he had determined to remove the obnoxious quaestor and prefect. This only made matters worse. After burning the official residence of the prefect of the city, the mob mustered in a most threatening attitude outside the palace. This constrained the emperor to use force, but he happened to be very short of soldiery at the moment. All the garrison of Constantinople, save 3,500 of the Scholari, or Imperial Guard, had been sent off to the Persian War. Only 2 regiments had as yet returned, a corps of 500 cuirasses under Belisarius, and a body of Heruli of about the same number. 5,000 men were hardly enough to cope with an angry populace of 500,000 souls in the narrow streets of the capital. When attacked by the troops, the rioters set fire to the city, and an awful conflagration ensued. The great church of St. Sophia perished among the flames, together with all the houses and public buildings to the north and east of it. Blood having once flowed, the mob was set upon something more than a riot. A revolution was in the air, and the Greens, who took the lead in the struggle, sought about for their favorite, the patrician Hypatius, the nephew of their old patrician Anastasius I. But Hypatius was a prudent and cautious person, with no ambition to risk his head. He had entered the palace and put himself in Justinian's hands to keep out of harm's way. It was not till the emperor, who field traitors about him, ordered all senators to retire to their homes, that Hypatius fell into the hands of his own partisans. The unhappy rebel, in spite of himself, was at once hurried off to the hippodrome, placed on the imperial seat, and crowned with a diadem extemporized from his wife's gold necklace. It was in vain that Justinian issued from the palace next day and proclaimed an amnesty. He was chased back with insulting cries. Losing heart, he summoned the chief of his courtiers and guards, and proposed to them to abandon Constantinople and take refuge in Asia, as Zeno had done in a similar time of trouble. John of Cappadocia and many of the ministers advised him to fly, but the intrepid Theodora stepped forward to save her husband from destruction. "It has been said," she cried, "that the voice of a woman should not be heard among the councils of men. But those whose interests are most concerned have the best right to speak. To death inevitable we must all submit, but to survive dignity and honor, and to descend from the empire to exile, to such shame there is no compulsion. Never shall the day come when I put off this purple robe, and am no more hailed as the sovereign lady. If you wish to protract your life, O Emperor, flight is easy. There are your ships and there is the sea. But consider whether, if you escape to exile, you will not wish every day that you were dead. As for me, I hold with the ancient saying that the imperial purple is a glorious shroud." Spurred on by the fiery words of his wife, Justinian tried the fortune of war once more. A few reinforcements had arrived. With these and the harassed troops who had already faced 5 days' street fighting, Belisarius once more sallied forth from the palace. The rebels were off their guard, for a false rumor had got about that Justinian was already fled. At this moment the mob was crowding the hippodrome and saluting their creature with shouts of "Hypatie Auguste tu vincus." After a vain attempt to break in by the imperial staircase, Belisarius assaulted the main side gate of the circus and burst in at a point where the conflagration had 3 days before made a breach in the wall. Pinned into the great amphitheatre and taken by surprise, the rebels made a weak resistance. Soon they turned to fly, but all the issues were choked, and the victims of the sword of Belisarius were numbered by the 10,000. Hypatius and his brother were caught alive and brought to Justinian, who ordered them to be beheaded. The next day he heard of all the facts concerning the unwillingness of Hypatius, and gave his body honorable burial. It was many years before the blues and greens ever vexed him by another riot. The awful carnage in the circus kept the city quiet for a whole generation. Justinian was now free from trouble at home and abroad, and turned to these ambitious schemes of foreign policy which were to occupy the rest of his reign. The dream of his heart was to reunite the Roman Empire, by bringing once more under his scepter all those western provinces, which were occupied by Teutonic kings, and paid only the shadow of homage to the imperial name. A few years before, the dream would have seemed fantastically overweening, but of late matters had been growing more and more promising. Justinian was, compared with his four predecessors, young and vigorous. He had an immense store of treasure, all the horde of Anastasius, a large and efficient army, and at least one general of first-rate ability. His throne was firmly rooted, his eastern frontier secure. Nothing now prevented him from undertaking wars of aggression. Meanwhile, everything in the west favored his projects. In Italy, the great Theodoric was dead, and since his death, the Ostrogothic kingdom had been faring ill. The old hero had left his realm to his grandson Athalaric, a boy of 8 years old, under the guardianship of his mother Amalsuintha, the widow of Eutharic. The daughter of Theodoric was a clever and masterful woman, but she had a difficult task in teaching the turbulent Ostrogoths to obey a female regent. They murmured at all her doings, and most especially at her taste for Roman and Greek letters, and her frequent promotions of Roman officials. She strove to bring up her son, it was said, more as an Italian than a Goth, placing him under Roman tutors and keeping him tight to the desk, in spite of the saying of Theodoric that, "Who has trembled before the pedagogue's rod will not face the spear willingly." It was as much as Amalsuintha could do to keep the Goths in their obedience while her son was young. But when he attained the age of 12 or 13, and began to show some will of his own, the murmurs of the people grew louder. At last, when he had one day been chastised by his mother, he burst into the guardroom and bade his subjects take note of how a king of the Goths was treated worse than a slave. This scene produced a tumult, and the chiefs of the Goths took the education of the boy out of his mother's hands, though they left her the regency. Handed over to unsuitable companions, Athalaric grew idle, drunken, and reckless. He was of a weakly habit of body, and before he reached manhood and developed the symptoms of consumption. Meanwhile, Amalsuintha was contending for power with the chiefs of the Goths, and had earned much unpopularity by putting to death, without form of trial, the 3 heads of the party which opposed her. So uncertain was her position that she sent secretly to Justinian in 533 to beg him to give her refuge at Dyrrhachium if she should be forced to fly. The emperor soon grasped the position. A divided people, an unpopular regent, a boy king sinking into his grave invited him to active interference in Italy. In Africa, the condition of affairs was equally tempting. We have already mentioned how, on the death of King Thrasimund, the Vandal throne had fallen to his kinsman Hilderic, son of King Honoric, and the Roman princess Eudocia. Hilderic was elderly, unversed in affairs of state, and a conscientious Catholic, inheriting from his Roman mother an orthodoxy which his Arian subjects detested. He had but a short reign of 7 years, but in it he succeeded in alienating the affections of the Vandals in every way. He incurred great odium for putting to death his predecessor's widow Amalfrida, the sister of the great Theodoric, because he found her conspiring against him. His wars were uniformly unsuccessful. The Moors of Atlas cut to pieces a whole army and pushed their incursions close to the gates of Carthage. Probably his open confession of Catholicism and promotion of Catholics to high offices were even greater sources of wrath. In 530, his cousin Guilemir organized a conspiracy against him, overthrew him with ease, and plunged him into a dungeon. Justinian professed great indignation at this dethroning of an orthodox and friendly sovereign, and resolved to make use of it as a grievance against the new king of the Vandals. Just before the Nika sedition broke out, he had sent an embassy to Carthage to bid Guilemir replace his cousin on the throne and be contented with the place of regent. The usurper answered rudely enough. King Guilemir wishes to point out to King Justinian that it is a good thing for rulers to mind their own business. He trusted to the remoteness of his situation and the domestic troubles of Justinian, and little thought that he was drawing down another storm on his head. For Justinian had fully made up his mind to begin his attack on the west by subduing the Vandals. All things were in his favour, notably the fact that the Arian king was once more making life miserable to the African Catholics, and that the Vandal and Ostrogoth had been completely estranged by the murder of Amalfrida 9 years before. Amalswintha favoured rather than discouraged the emperor's attack on her nearest Teutonic neighbours. There was yet one more piece of good fortune. King Guilemir had just sent off the flower of the Vandal troops to an expedition against Sardinia. Encouraged by these considerations, Justinian prepared an army for the invasion of Africa in the summer of 533. Although some of his ministers, and above all the financier, John of Cappadocia, warned him against attacking the ends of the earth, from which a message would hardly reach Byzantium in a year. A ridiculous plea to anyone who remembered the ancient organization of the empire. The army was not very large. It consisted of 10,000 foot and 500 horse, half regular troops from the Asiatic provinces, half Hunnish and Herulian auxiliaries. But its commander Belisarius was a host in himself, and confidence in him buoyed up many who would otherwise have despaired. The voyage was protracted by contrary winds to the unprecedented length of 80 days. But at last the armament cast anchor at Caput Vada, on the cape which faces Sicily, in the beginning of September. The Vandals were caught wholly unprepared. The king was absent in Numidia, their best troops were in Sardinia, their fleet had not even been launched. A blind confidence in their remoteness from Constantinople had led them to despise all Justinian's threats, and no preparation whatever had been made against an invasion. Guilemir hurried down to the coast, put his prisoner Hilderic to death, and summoned in his warriors from every side. But it was 11 days before he mustered in sufficient force to attack the Romans. And meanwhile Belisarius had advanced unopposed to within 10 miles of the gates of Carthage. The provincials received him everywhere with joy, for he proclaimed that he came to deliver them from Arian oppression, and kept their soldiery in such good order that not a field or a cottage was plundered. And I think I'm going to leave it there, leaving it on an up note tonight. As always, if you would like to pick up where I'm leaving off, you can find the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. Good night, and sweet dreams.